I am so honored to have on the podcast today Johan Norberg, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and a writer who focuses on globalization, human progress, and intellectual history. He is the author and editor of more than 20 books translated into more than 30 languages. These books include In Defense of Global Capitalism, Progress, 10 Reasons to Look Forward to the Future, and Open, The Story of Human Progress. Both latter books were named by The Economist as a Book of the Year in 2016 and 2020, respectively. Johan's latest book is The Capitalist Manifesto: Why the Global Free Market Will Save the World, which we will spend most of our time today talking about. In addition to his many books, Johan is also the creator and host of numerous television documentaries on subjects such as energy, economics, Sweden, India, and Adam Smith. Johan Norberg, welcome to the LiberatED podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad to have you here. I know that it is evening time in Sweden where you're based, and so I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us in these evening hours. And I'm really excited to talk more about your book, The Capitalist Manifesto. I absolutely loved it. Encourage everyone to read and or listen to The Capitalist Manifesto. Love to start with your motivation for writing this book.
Yeah, that's a great starting point. The reason why I wrote this book is that I didn't used to be a fan of free market capitalism. I used to think that well, with all the problems we've got in our economy and the world, when I grew up, it seemed to be that there must have been something better at other points of time, other better systems where people lived more in harmony with one another and with nature. And the thing that happened was that I started studying history, and I started to study the history of my ancestors in northern Sweden, and realizing that they didn't live ecologically. They died ecologically at a very young age. When there was a bad weather, there was a crop failure, and people starved. And that made me obsessed with human progress, to think about what made this kind of world possible, where the average person on the planet leads a better life than actually the kings and the emperors did 200 years ago. And that created this obsession with finding out what role does business, technology, innovation, economic growth play in improving human life. And that's the sort of the long-term motivation. But when you ask me about my specific immediate motivation, it's the fact that over the past, say, 20 years, capitalism has continued to create immense progress. 140,000 people have been lifted out of extreme poverty every day over those more than 2 decades. And yet, we have lost the debate because it seems like people on both the left, but also on the sort of the nationalist populist right, are also opposed to an open world economy with free trade and free markets. So I thought that someone has to speak up for this system that actually improves social economic indicators more than at any other point in human history.
So, why do you think capitalism gets this bad rap despite this breathtaking track record of human progress and human flourishing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I think one important reason is that our mindset, our human psychology is not really adapted to the modern world because, Homo sapiens, we've lived for 300,000 years in something like a zero-sum game, in a world where we didn't see much of technological innovation or economic growth over the average person's lifespan. When archaeologists talk about this as a new axe, or something like that. It's 5,000 years old. So nothing much happened over the individual person's lifespan. So we're not used to thinking about how we can have positive sum games, how economic growth, how technological innovation can help different groups and different parts of the world at the same time. We're used to thinking that if someone is better off, if someone is successful, it's a threat to us. Because, once upon a time, that was usually the case. If they were wealthy, they probably stole it from us. But what has happened now in the past, say, 200 years with the development of liberal democracy and free market capitalism is that for the first time we have a system where you can get rich, but only by enriching others. With a system of rule of law, property rights, and free trade, you have to provide people with value if they are to hand over their money to you. So you have to think very hard about what's in their interest and try very hard to get it to them. And that creates value for all groups. That's what has raised 140,000 people out of extreme poverty every day. But I don't think our minds are there. We have a very hard time comprehending this. So we always think that, a wealthy entrepreneur, he's probably took it from us, cheated us somehow, or another country, we have to put up tariffs to block them, or immigrants in our country, they are probably sort of taking resources that we would otherwise have. So I think it's here in our mindset somehow, this difficulty in understanding how capitalism can lift all boats.
One of your early chapters in the Capitalist Manifesto is Life Under Savage Capitalism, which I think is such a great title because, again, this sort of reputation of capitalism as extractive or exploitative or just harmful, it's really the exact opposite. And you sort of take the reader through these data, some of which you've mentioned around lifting, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty over the past several years. It just shows that it's the opposite of sort of greed and extraction and harm. It's about value creation and human prosperity. I wonder if you could share some more of your findings that highlight this.
Yeah, the thing that really, to me, highlights what's going on in the world is that if we're looking at the almost 25 years now since the turn of the millennium, let's admit it, it's been pretty awful, right? We've had the global financial crisis and we've had the pandemic that shut down the world. We've had endless wars in the Middle East, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and then inflation and interest rates rises. It's been terrible. And yet, if we look at objective indicators of human progress, of indicators of human well-being, these have actually also been the best 25 years in human history. We've reduced extreme poverty, according to the World Bank, by 2/3, something like that. If you measure the average wealth, the income of the average person on the planet, almost a third of it was created. Almost a third of all the wealth that has ever been created was created during these 25 years. We've seen that when it comes to child mortality, it's been roughly cut in half, which means that 2.2 million fewer children died last year than in 2003. So on almost every indicator you choose to look at, the world has improved dramatically despite these pushbacks and headwinds. And why is that? And I think that's because human beings are problem solvers. We adapt to new problems. We improvise. We come up with new solutions. The way that businesses rebuilt supply chains during the pandemic when their suppliers were suddenly under lockdown and couldn't produce the goods that they needed, the inputs, resources that they needed when the workforce couldn't get there. They started to rebuild things, weak manufacturing processes to come up with something and reroute the blockages, the tariffs that were put in place there. So it's that, Henry David Thoreau, the transcendentalist philosopher, poet, writer, he put it thus in 150 years ago. It's almost as if trade and commerce are made of rubber because they bounce on top of every obstacle that the government and nature puts in their way. And that's really, to me, what free markets is about. It's not a sort of a system, the top-down system in any way. It's millions and millions of people constantly looking at the world from their vantage point, thinking about how can I improve things? How can I solve problems? And if we all constantly work hard to try and solve problems, we create amazing things.
You talk a lot in the book about sort of the intersection between capitalism and innovation and entrepreneurship. What are the conditions under free market capitalism that allow entrepreneurship and innovation to thrive?
Yeah, this has been a particular obsession of mine, because everything that we now take for granted was once a very disruptive innovation, from the printing press to the fiber optics that makes it possible for us to communicate between Europe and America in real time. And this is what I've learned from technology history. It's disruptive and it's unpredictable. It wouldn't be an innovation if we knew what it was all about. It's all dependent on something entirely new entering the world. And that, to me, when I look at business history and technology history, it rarely comes from a committee, it rarely comes from the government, but neither does it come from individual geniuses who come up with things. There are individual geniuses for sure, but it doesn't help much because we need something else. We need an entire ecosystem of trial and error, of thousands of people constantly trying to get something to work. It might start with a vision from a lone individual, but then it's trial and error, experiments from lots of people, and then lots of failure, which is really not failure, but a way of collecting more data on what works and what doesn't, and then incremental improvement and adaptation, and then new solutions. And then voila, you end up with a microprocessor, you end up with spaceships, and you end up with all those technologies that we take for granted. So it's unpredictable, and that's one reason why it thrives in open societies and free markets. Because if you have people at the top deciding who gets to do what, where we will send our capital and our resources, who is allowed to go ahead, then you're limited to the knowledge that we already have. And that will block the future. We need to be open for surprises. We need to be open for innovation. And that's one reason why free markets are intimately connected to the possibility of rapid disruptive innovation.
So, Johan, I interview a lot of school founders, especially former public school teachers who left the classroom because they felt like they were constrained within a conventional sort of top-down educational model and knew that they could do things that were more innovative and serve students better outside of that system. So they've created their own schools and learning spaces, micro schools, learning pods, homeschooling collaboratives, and so on. But I'll often hear some of these founders, have a bit of reticence around this idea of capitalism or this idea of sort of running a business because they feel like they're educators, that this should all be sort of a charitable endeavor. What would you say to them about sort of this tension between running maybe a for-profit enterprise or maybe a nonprofit enterprise that, of course, is still a small business, and sort of feeling concerned about that?
Yeah, I can understand that because you might enter your life's mission, your career from different perspectives. It might be that someone has the sole objective of making a profit. Somebody else might be in it for changing the world or saving humanity one student at a time. And those are different motivations. And I can understand why someone who's got that objective might feel like they've met so many people who are only in business for money, for the profit, and they're entirely different worlds. But then I think it's important to understand. First of all, I mean, profit is rarely for any business the sole motivation. As John Mackey, the very successful founder of Whole Foods, once put it, I mean, profit is like air. We need it in order to be successful and to continue to breathe and continue to move on with what we're trying to accomplish. But we don't do this just to breathe air, because that's, I mean, we need more motivations in order to accomplish things. And I think that's what you find out when, at least when I talk to entrepreneurs in other fields, from technology to grocery. I mean, they're passionate about what they are doing, about their products, about their goods and services, and how that improves the life of their customers. Um, and the thing that really helps to channel all these efforts into something that's important for others is profits and the profit motive. It's not the only thing, but it's something that helps you to constantly stay focused on what others are interested in. And again, I think this goes back to the mistaken idea that the economy is a zero-sum game. If someone profits, he takes that profit from somebody else. That's not really what happens. Look at an entrepreneur who goes into any field, any sector, starts a business and wants to accomplish something and end up with a profit. What does that take? Well, it takes lots of things. First of all, it takes you employing people who will help you out, and they expect a wage, whether or not you're able to sell your goods and services or not. Then suppliers, and you're going to have to pay them instantly. Then you perhaps you take a loan, and then you pay an interest rate on that loan. And you need customers, someone who comes there and thinks that what you are offering is worth more to them than the money that they're handing over to you. Then and only then, if you've been able to make all these four groups happy, the customers, your employees, those who lent you money, and your suppliers, and improved all of their lives, only then, if you still are able to have something left afterwards, which will obviously be heavily taxed, so you will also make the tax authorities and the government happy, then you'll get a tiny profit at the end of it, which is often reinvested in your business to make it even more successful. So profit is really, I mean, it's the kind of GPS that sort of directs you to the very position on the map where you make the most benefit for most other people. And I know we're not talking about profit like this in society, in politics, and some people who make profits don't talk about it either in this way. And that's a problem. That's a mistake, because I think this is really a machinery to help us direct our efforts to the needs and demands of other people. And that's a beautiful thing.
So, Johan, your book, champions free market capitalism. It is surrounded, though, by other books in recent years that have come out calling for alternatives to capitalism, maybe saying sort of in a derogatory way that we're at end stage capitalism, or that rising inequality, or people who are still struggling to make ends meet or climate change, larger global problems. These are all signals that capitalism isn't working and we need an alternative to capitalism. What do you say to those critics?
Well, those are many criticisms and many critical books, but to point to just a few of them, the first thing I would say is that whatever our mission is, whatever we are trying to accomplish on this planet, we're going to need economic growth because that's the one thing that will help us to do more things tomorrow than we did yesterday. That's what economic growth is about. It's not about sort of piling stuff on top of each other. It's not about just more things. It's about solving problems and having more technological and productive capacity. And we need that to deal with global warming, for example. Some 40 countries on the planet have been able to reduce carbon dioxide while emissions while still being able to grow their economies. And they just happen to be the wealthiest, fastest growing economies on the planet as well. We need that to deal with problems like people lagging behind, finding that they are still finding that their opportunity to deal with life's precariousness is challenging. Now we've had obviously the inflation and the interest rate backlash recently, which is, I think, it's directly caused by big government solutions to our problems. The past two administrations tried to deal with problems by just spending and spending money, which means that too much money was chasing too few goods, and then we end up with inflation, and that erodes wages, and that's something that's incredibly destructive to our living standards and to our real wages. So whatever we're trying to accomplish, we need more productive capacity. How do we get there? Well, we get there by allowing people as much freedom as possible to experiment with their own life, their organizations, their business models from their particular vantage points and see if they can find a way to do something a little bit better tomorrow. Many will obviously not be successful, but some will be successful, and we will all be imitating them. And that's how we've created progress over the past 200 years by having as many, there's a saying in programming, with a sufficient number of eyeballs looking at the code, every bug is shallow. So there will be a possibility to solve every problem in the code if a sufficient number of people are looking at it. The same goes for the global economy and the global world. If a sufficient number of eyeballs are looking at the problems of the world and are using their brains to try to come up with a new way of dealing with it, every bug will be, if not shallow, at least more shallow than they would otherwise be.
You mentioned earlier, Johan, that the attacks on capitalism come from both the political left and the political right. You mentioned tariffs on the political right. Of course, President-elect Trump has promised to impose tariffs, which slows trade and globalization. Slowing immigration also does the same thing. On the left, you talk about efforts around climate change that focus on degrowth strategies and sort of consuming less, traveling less, settling for less is what you say. And just quoting from you here, you say, "It is my sincere conviction that this would be the worst thing we could do for the world and for the climate," sort of pushing back, becoming more insular, becoming less global. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the importance of sort of a global view of economic prosperity.
Sure. First of all, the reason why a global world and open world economy is important is that it gives us access to more brains and to more talent around the world. Well, we might be the smartest people in the room, but every room we're in is very small. If we want to have access to more ideas, more creativity, more hard work, we have to broaden out and look at what is going on in other places. That's what we're doing in a global culture and a global economy. We're benefiting from the ideas of others. We're benefiting from their innovation because they then, that offers us something more, cheaper goods or services or better technologies, and then we get that in exchange for the best things that we are doing. Trade is really a machine into which we put what we're able to produce. If we're farmers, we're putting soybeans and we're putting maize in there. And on the other side of the machine, we get computers and irrigation systems and GPS systems that we couldn't have produced for ourselves. If I'm an author, I put my books on one side of the machine, and on the other side, I'll get the food stuff and the technology that I wouldn't be able to produce. It's really a way of making use of other people's talents and creativity to benefit ourselves. And when we're looking throughout history, the countries that are most successful are not just the ones who happen to have the smartest people. They're the ones who are able to use the smart people in other places as well. And that's why I think that protectionism and anti-globalization is always self-defeating. It's a way of restricting yourself from the best solutions and alternatives on the planet. And it's very dangerous when it comes to things like global warming, because then we need the best materials, the cheapest solar panels, the best electric vehicles wherever they are produced. And then we need economies of scale, we need specialization so that we're constantly benefiting from the best things. And so that's how we do it. And yeah, you mentioned degrowth as a solution to global warming. The reason why I think it's the worst idea, it's the most stupid idea that smart people still believe in. The reason is that we've just tried that. Unintentionally, we experimented with degrowth during the pandemic, because when we had the pandemic, half the world's population, more than half the world's population, was under curfew, house arrest. They weren't even allowed to leave their homes. Flights were grounded, trade was blocked. It was, in a way, despite the tragic circumstances, the dream of the sort of the green degrowthers, because nothing much happened in the economy. And yes, it was awful for the economy and for poverty and for nutrition, access to nutrition in poor countries and so on. But it did really help the environment that much. Oh, in 2020, the year of the lockdowns, global carbon dioxide emissions were reduced by no more than 6%. Just 6%. That's nothing in the great scheme of things. If we were to reach the international Paris Climate Accords until 2030 in this way, we would need one pandemic like that every year, without any kind of economic rebound in between. That would be a disaster for human capacity, poverty, access to food, and so on. So it's an awful degrowth would be a terrible counterproductive way of trying to get there. And the first thing that would happen is that people would stop caring about the environment. That's what we're seeing in every recession. The first thing that happens is that we don't want to invest in green technologies that might pay off 20, 50, or 100 years from now. Only economic growth and continued human progress makes it possible for us to do that in a way that's compatible with human flourishing.
Mm. So the book we've been talking about today, Johan, is the Capitalist Manifesto, but you're such a prolific writer. You have a new book that will be coming out in 2025. I wonder if you could give us a sneak preview of that.
Oh, yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you for the opportunity. It's a book about history's golden ages, what we talk about when we talk about golden ages. So from ancient Athens and Rome, Abbasid Baghdad, the Italian Renaissance, China under the Song dynasty, and so on, and trying to figure out what made them successful and why did they eventually fail. So the rise and decline and what we can learn from them. And the working title is Peak Human. I don't know if we'll be able to call it that in the end, because some people say it sounds like it's an exercise book or something like that. But it's really
I
about
like it.
how do thank you. So it's really about how do we create dynamic creative societies? And one lesson is very much related to what we've been talking about: openness to surprises, surprises from abroad, and traders, merchants, migrants, missionaries who come up with, who learn new ideas in strange places, or surprises domestically because people constantly try to come up with new ideas. Those societies who were open to that, they benefited from cultural creativity, technological innovation, and often economic growth in a much more than other societies at that same time. And then, unfortunately, they eventually failed, and they often did when they become fearful, afraid of the world, or started to lose cultural self-confidence, and then they tried to isolate themselves from the world, so they lost access to what was going on in other places, and they started to demand strong men, big governments to protect them, point them in the right direction. And unfortunately, those strong men often pointed people in the wrong direction, and they ended up in losing lots of that dispersed, decentralized creativity that had made them successful originally.
Oh, it sounds fascinating. I can't wait to read it. It sounds like this book will be out in the spring of 2025. So if
That's right.
my listeners and viewers want to connect with you, Johan, and maybe buy the Capitalist Manifesto, watch for your new book, what is the best way for them to do that?
I've realized that the best way is often just to Google my name, because the dispersed knowledge about me is bigger than the knowledge I myself have about where all my stuff is. But they can also go to my website, johannorberg.net, N-E-T, or to the Cato Institute, and search for Johan Norberg and the Cato Institute, and then lots of my stuff will be there. Or just find me on social media. I'll be there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights on the Capitalist Manifesto, why we should be embracing free markets. And so looking forward to your forthcoming book as well. Johan Norberg, thank you so much for being on the LiberatED podcast.
Thank you, Kerry. This was a pleasure.